So somatosensation, which is sensations from the body, because somato means body. Remember, soma is the cell body, is so much more than Aristotle's touch. And I want you to consider and think about all the different types of sensory details that can be detected by specialized afferents that are arrayed around our bodies and the various perceptual associations or perceptual experiences that we can have. Now, our body perceptual experience is quite a rich perceptual experience. We understand, for example, where we are located typically, like, what I am reaching for, how my limbs are extended, even in the absence of visual information, right? And we also are aware, for example, of, what we may be touching, whether I'm gripping or holding on to something. All of these are aspects of what we call mechanoreception, tactile sense, kinesthetic movement sense, and proprioception, which is that sense of body position. However, there's another whole, aspect of somatosensory experience, right? We can also perceive, for example, if we've been injured. We can perceive our temperature. We can perceive if we've got an itch, right? There's actually sensual aspects of tactile, input as well. So somatosensation, our perceptual experience is rich and detailed and immersive, and it involves the integration of lots of these different, sensory aspects of the body. However, there are two great categories of sensory detection, and they transit up two distinct cables, sets of cables in your spinal cord, and they largely arrive in two distinct cortical regions of your brain. So basically, we talk about mechanoreception, proprioception, remember body position sense, and sort of kinesthetic senses, tactile, right? And that's important information about where I am, what I'm touching, where I'm moving, and things like that. That information, you want that to rise up to the brain as quickly as possible. And I'm going to tell you that these are some of the longest specialized sensory afferents that we've got. It's basically some of the longest neurons that we have in our nervous system. So from your toe, when you touch something, you're going to see there's a single cell, and they're quite remarkable cells. They're called pseudo-unipolar cells. We'll talk more about these in other videos, but they start out in your toe. They're going to work their way up. Their cell body is going to be located in a nerve root along your spinal nerve roots, the dorsal root, the one towards the back, the dorsal side. There's a ganglion, there's a cluster of cell bodies that hangs off that called the dorsal root ganglion. And then it's got another component which is going to work its way up, straight up the back of your spinal cord, into the brainstem for its first synaptic connection. So these are really long cells when we're talking about the mechanoreceptive end of things. And the mechanoreceptive, proprioceptive information is ultimately going to arrive in the S1, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. It's the first gyrus, the postcentral gyrus that we have right after the postcentral sulcus in the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is going to be the arrival site, cortical arrival site for most of, there's going to be some other distribution, but most of it, like 90% of it, of the mechanoreceptive and the tactile and the proprioceptive information, into the brain. While the other category of stimuli, right, from the body is kind of visceral stimuli, injury, nociception, temperature, itch, sensual touch. That is going to have a very different, origin and different kinds of afferent receptors, specialized receptors like nociceptors, thermoreceptors, etc. It's also going to work its way to very different targets, actually, because I want you to think, here's mechanoreception. You just got to know where you are and update maps and, feel your position, etc., and make decisions based upon that. Gets up very quickly. But for, let's say, nociception, injury, you have a reflexive withdrawal response from injury, right? So this information, the emotionally salient bodily information, is going to be shorter. Neurons are going to stop in more places, like in the spinal cord for reflexive responses, in the brainstem for arousal, like a lot of these emotionally salient stimuli will, wake you up and alert you. For orienting, like if you injure yourself, you not only withdraw, but you also look in that direction. And then ultimately, in terms of our perceptual experience, it's a very different perceptual experience when we're talking about emotionally salient stimuli, as opposed to just, yes, I made contact by touching over here, or my limb is extended like this. So there's a different lobe of the brain that receives, initially this information, and that lobe is quite deep in the brain. It's deep inside this great big lateral fissure that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. It's actually a lobe that's deep inside that's known as the insular lobe. That's where the majority of this visceral, nociceptive, thermoreceptive, itch-sensitive, sensual touch-sensitive kind of salient information is going to initially arrive at the level of the cortex. So mechanoreception, we're going to be talking about that. Very important, parietally directed mapping. Very long axons, specialized receptors. We're going to see that respond to touch and pressure and all these things. And then there's the emotionally salient stuff, the thermoreceptors, the nociceptors, the itch receptors, the sensual touch receptors that are going to travel in a completely different set of cables in your spinal cord, go to more places because they're important for reflexive responses, orienting responses, arousal responses, and then ultimately end up in a different lobe of the brain in the insular lobe. So more on this soon.